All right, now, so yeah, we have more data, coming out for the African continent. The latest one in January 2025, we see African startups. They reached an impressive milestone, raising a record $289 million in funding. This marks a remarkable 240% increase from the $85 million raised just a year ago in January 2024. This surge places January 2025 as the second best month for startup funding in the past 6 years, only behind the funding peak of January 2022. With the dramatic rise in investments, we're witnessing a promising shift in the African startup landscape. All right, let's explore what's driving the momentum now. Joining us is Isaac Marshall, investor at TLG Capital. TLG Capital is a private investment firm which invests in SMEs across sub-Saharan Africa. Great to have you on the show. Good morning.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Lottie. Long time.
Yeah, a long time. It's great to see you again. And definitely, I'm sure you've been quite busy, since the last time we saw, because we're seeing this funding, coming in January for Africa. Talk to me about what factors you think contributed to 240% increase in funding for African startups, and that's just for January 2025.
Yeah, no, I think the year has started off extremely strong. And I think there's sort of two dynamics here. The first is the macro, right? Because if you look at the top four markets of where African venture capital is raised, the markets, right? It's Nigeria, it's Kenya, it's South Africa, it's Egypt. So if we look at last year to this year in all four of those markets, right? So Nigeria, 2023, the currency cuts by roughly half. 2024, the currency cuts by roughly 2/5, right? And towards the end of the year, stabilized, right? The last 3 to 6 months, we've seen general stability in the Naira exchange rate. Then you look at Kenya. There was a situation where there was almost a near default scenario on the sovereign debt that was now restructured, and now they've sort of been upgraded from a credit perspective. Egypt had this massive deal with the UAE that sort of effectively bailed them out and gave them a fresh trajectory of renewed growth. And South Africa has just seen a credit upgrade at the end of 2024 at the sovereign level, right? And so if you think about it, a lot of startup funding lags the macro environment. And this is true aside from just startup funding. It's just generally investors always lag. So when the trends are beginning to turn positive, that's when the dollars flow through. And really at the end of last year is when you saw the Money Point exit, you saw the Time investment in South Africa. And so now I think starting the year off, as a result, there's renewed investment activity on the back of those flows. And I think it's quite exciting.
Looking, more at this data, we're seeing equity financing that dominated the funding landscape. What does this, indicate about investor confidence, in African startups?
Yeah. Look, debt markets are structurally underdeveloped, right? Because there are kind of two problems. First off, as you know, the banks struggle to back some of the more tech-based models, right? And at the same time, there aren't a whole lot of private credit investors that operate in the African continent. And the reason why is, a variety of reasons. The currency, the size of the market is difficult to track. But I think the resurgence in equity is really the barometer of how everything else moves. I think when you see more equity pour into these startups, that's when debt begins to pick up. I think the leading indicator is actually equity funding rounds. And what the VCs are funding is also quite interesting. Because when you look at global VC, today it's really an AI play, right? Everybody is talking about 50% of global inflows into VC are going into AI companies, right? In Africa, it's a fintech play. 50% of the flows are going into financial technology companies, right? In other words, to provide the banking rails that don't exist to circulate credit throughout the economy. Right. So it's also in Africa, the VCs are funding a very specific part of the market, which is important to think about.
All right. So, it's going to fintechs again. Are you seeing any other industry, getting attention, at this point? Are there any indicators, that we're looking at other industries, not just, fintech? And is fintech getting boring?
Yeah.
Is it getting boring yet?
It's interesting because, Lottie, I think one of the challenges is that in the very beginning of VC market development in Africa, if you look at Nigeria's market development, it actually began with homegrown entrepreneurs. And oftentimes there is a concern from the global investment community that, okay, one of the challenges with African markets is because you have development finance and other impact investors, the risk premiums, the rate of returns are not that high because you have other people investing that have sort of non-commercial goals. Venture capital is perhaps the big exception to this. And this is not talked about very often, but actually, if you look at how venture capital emerged, it really was in the beginning homegrown angel investors, homegrown entrepreneurs who had built businesses and sold them, backing their compatriot entrepreneurs and getting the industry off the ground. And I think now that has begun to evolve, where you're now beginning to see development finance dollars entering the market in full. And I think while VC has been a big focus in fintech, the other sectors that you need to see, in my view, are really these industrial type businesses. Because in contexts where most stuff in Nigeria is imported, most stuff in Kenya is imported across the continent, there's a huge amount of imports, and there's opportunity to manufacture. But what you need is a shifting in return expectations for that to happen, right? If you're going to fund early stage entrepreneurs that are building industrial businesses, it's a very different return expectation than sometimes venture capital is looking for. And I think it's also a much more patient form of capital than I think people are typically used to seeing in venture.
And talking about, being patient at this point, we know raising this capital is not a walk in the park, What challenges or opportunities do you see, African startups, facing as they continue to attract, global investment?
I think that the big theme is this: venture capital and startup markets will develop when African entrepreneurs are able to build businesses that are solving global problems, right? I think oftentimes people think about their business just solving a local problem, but I think in a world where increasingly you can tap into and scaffold on top of many of the AI tools that are coming out, you can scaffold on top of many of the other financial infrastructure plays that are coming out. I think that there's a real opportunity to develop and scale to tackle problems that are both within a country and across countries in Africa and even around the world. So I think long run, I'm quite opportunistic on one thing above all else, and that's that the entrepreneurial spirit in these markets is actually enormous. I think, as you know, it's like every single person you meet from Nigeria has like 3 jobs at the same time. They're starting so many different ventures, and that's because in the culture, there's a sense of ownership, there's a sense of creativity, there's a sense of solving problems. And I think that is really what's going to put these markets at the forefront and really creates the opportunity set.
Right, Isaac, and I'm starting to wonder, how many jobs do I have at this point? Maybe, anyway, I'll try to remember.
You wear so many hats, my friend.
All right, so what trends are you expecting that will shape the African startup ecosystem in 2025? And, that's according to industry leaders.
Look, the truth is, if you look globally, most of the time when startups do well, it's because they are growing users and growing revenue to solve a problem, and then they get acquired by one of the large tech players, right? That's typically how things play out in the West, in the United States in particular, with the startup scene, which is really the main startup scene globally when you look at just size. In Africa, the dynamic is a little bit different. Exits are a lot tougher. You have money point, you have time, but these are relatively rare situations. Most startups don't have the destiny that Moneypoint or the destiny that Time or MNT has had. And so I think in Africa, the name of the game is profitability, and the name of the game is surviving. If you can demonstrate that you can solve a problem, don't try to scale too quickly. All the time I see fintech companies that are doing lending businesses that grow too fast, too quickly, and they start facing large non-performance, they start burning through money. This is a very challenging model. I think the name of the game in Africa is, there's this saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go farther, go together. I think the name of the game in Africa is, if you want to go farther, don't burn money. Don't focus on profitability, focus on keeping the business alive, because there aren't that many competitors. And so if you can stay alive in the market for longer, then you can end up owning the market and you can end up providing solutions that are needed to a lot of customers. But the critical thing is profitability and keeping the business going.
Right, and talking about profitability, I know you investors, you also look at local currency. You put your eyes on what's playing out with the local currency. Are you getting confident, about the naira going into 2025?
Look, I told you, what is it, 4 months ago, I've been long the naira in my personal account. At the level of my firm, we hedge all of our investments in local currency, but I think it's been pretty stable. Right. I mean, the naira, I haven't seen, if anything, actually, the last time I exchanged naira into dollar, it was a higher exchange rate. Right. Which is fantastic. I think really kudos go out to everyone who's look, I think on the ground, it's extremely difficult for people because inflation has come so high. Oil and gas, gas at the pump is so expensive. The imports that people are buying are so high. But I do think the situation has stabilized markedly from 6 months ago. And I think on a going forward basis, I think that these currencies are cheap. I think that there's really an opportunity to invest. And I think that, of course, it takes time for the global investment community to see that opportunity. Right. So I think the folks who know the market will enter. And then over time, I see a lot more flows coming to these markets because we're really coming out of a difficult period. And I think the years ahead are very, very positive. A lot of bitter medicine has been swallowed. And I think we have to watch that take root.
Right. And, talking about the bitter medicine, at this point, we're definitely hoping it gets easier, going forward. Yeah. But, it's a record raise, for January, $289 million compared to 2024's $85 million. But how can African startups maintain this growth, trajectory and, further solidify their position on the global stage?
It's a great question, Lottie. I think the core message is to generate their own cash flow. I think try to solve problems that are smaller rather than bigger first, which is super counterintuitive. Oftentimes you see US or global companies, they try and solve these enormous problems right at the gate. But the truth is, most of the outcomes globally are actually negative. I think the differences with global startups is that there's so much money that people lob at the problem that businesses don't die for a lot longer. I think problems are allowed to persist and fester until finally they cataclysmically fall apart because people just continue to take bets on the entrepreneur because frankly they have too much money, and so they just keep lobbing money into the problem. But in Africa, that kind of liquidity doesn't exist, and so as a result, problems and business models are detected much earlier, and the companies die much earlier. So I think the name of the game is really to, if you've raised a round, to focus on profitability, to focus on refining the model on a small scale first. I think that there's actually a huge amount of businesses to be built, by the way, that really solve small and local problems. And I think there's too much focus on massive scale. Just generating profitable businesses that are sustaining creates the platform by which you can solve bigger and bigger problems. And I think that's important both for the funds investing in Africa as well as the companies building.
All right. Thank you so much, Isaac Marshall, investor at TLG Capital. It's always great having your perspective. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lottie. Take care.